Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Morning, Dan.
Good morning, Karen.
Well, here we are looking at the end of February, and we are looking at fire season creeping up upon us.
Yeah, fire season, I guess, we always start the show talking about how warm it's been. but it's funny because I've been watching the news as far as like the national weather aspect of the news, and it's just a dead split. The West is getting so much cold and snow, and the East side seems to be getting so much warm, I guess rain as well. But it's just been such a split between the East and West side of the United States.
There's a lot of wind that we've had, and it's kind of offset the amount of rain that we have had. So it's really actually been kind of dry around this area lately. And with the high winds, it's really done a number on drying out the leaf litter and grasses. And so there have actually been several weather advisories recommending to not burn because the wind has been so impressive and nonstop.
Oh yeah, no, this wind's it's been pretty fierce, and it's usually a good like 3 or 4 days at a time. And plus we have such a drastic difference between the two fronts coming in from the west and what's already east, that it's causing, when you have two fronts that are very different in temperature and pressure, it causes those high winds to come. So, with that split that we were talking about, yeah, it's obvious that we're going to get some high, powerful winds as well.
And so we wanted to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about fire season and why it exists and what you need to be aware of, because for West Virginia, fire season starts on March 1st, and for Ohio, it also begins March 1st. So it's really important to recognize what is required by law in your area. And so in West Virginia, you are prohibited to burn except between the hours of 5 p.m. and 7 p.m. And for Ohio, it's 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. So just slightly different between the two states, but it's really important to recognize that what they're talking about is open burning. So if you're having a cookout and you're grilling hot dogs over a fire in your backyard, that's a little bit different. You definitely still shouldn't be doing that during a high wind period, but everyone gets this nice big brush pile of fallen limbs and things that they've collected over the winter that they just want to get rid of. But what we're asking you to do is to be very aware of the wind and the moisture conditions around you when you're trying to get rid of that brush pile. And so when you think about the fire triangle, right, just like we love triangles. We've got our IPM triangle, we've got our fire triangle. But what you need is you need to have oxygen, you need to have fuel, and you need to have ignition. And so there's oxygen all around us, and when the wind is blowing, it's adding lots and lots of oxygen to the area where a potential fire might be growing. And fuel, of course, we have dried leaves, we have dried grasses, we have broken limbs that are dried and on the ground. So all of those things are fuel. And then we have an ignition source, which could be an ember from your campfire or from your bonfire that's floating up through the sky. It's a little bit larger and it gets caught in a wind, and then it gets over and lands in a grassy field on the next hillside over or in your neighbor's yard. So it's really important to recognize how quickly fire can spread.
That's right. And if you're burning limbs that came down, a lot of times you'll have like a wooded area kind of maybe outside your property line, or close to a pasture or something. So you start putting the brush piles close to the wooded areas of your property. And you got to be careful with that too, because there's a lot of dead trees that will be naturally in those forested areas. It doesn't have to be a large forested area. It could be just a small little area that has a few trees and shrubs in it. But you got to think about that. We have a lot of ash trees that have been dead for a long time and are nice and dry. Other plants, I know we've lost a lot of spruces and things like that throughout the years. So if you have those dead trees kind of close by and you have those high winds, it wouldn't take much to move a fire onto those dead trees and basically move that fire in areas that you do not want it to burn.
Right. And, in forestry and in fire control, we talk about things called ladder fuels. So, a ladder fuel is basically a fuel that allows the fire to grow upwards. And so, let's think about if you're in an open forest where there's not a lot of understory. So, there's no shrubs, no grasses, no understory. It's very shady. Right. So there's very few ladder fuels in a situation like that. There's a lot of really tall trees, but there's not a whole lot of step ladders that allow the fire to climb up into the top of the canopy. But if you have an open area that has a lot of shrubs and low growing things, then those can allow the fire to go up higher. And so a lot of times, if you are in a wooded area that has burnt, you'll see that the fire actually doesn't get up very high on the trees. And depending on the species of tree, some are much more resistant to fire than others. So, for instance, black cherry, not very resistant to fire. That bark is fairly thin, and the fire can get into that cambial layer and kill the tree just with the heat of it, even if it doesn't actually catch fire. Whereas an oak, it has a thicker bark, it's much more resistant to fire. And it will typically have what we call a cat face or a scar on the uphill side where maybe something rolled down the hill and the fire kind of sat at the base of the tree. But if you don't have ladder fuels, and this is especially important up next to your home, you always want to make sure you keep a gap if you live in a wooded area between those potential ladder fuels, shrubs, and things and your house to give you that space to keep the fire from jumping from those woody materials up onto your house and onto your roof. You also want to make sure that any leaves are not collecting on your rooftop, which could also allow for that fire to spread more quickly. Now, from a burning perspective, the state law says that you need to have a 10-foot strip of a fire break between your burn pile and anything else that can catch fire. So, a fire break is simply a place where you have removed the fuel potential for that fire to spread. So you've taken out any flammable materials. Maybe you've just got a clear dirt area, maybe a mud pit from where your cattle have trampled all the grass over the winter. Those kind of places where there's no fuel. So you've taken out one of the corners of that triangle, and that's going to reduce the spread.
Yeah, distance from wooded lots too. Think about that. Make sure you're actually moving that pile of brush away from the wooded areas.
Yeah, because you don't want those flying embers to land on the trees.
And pay attention to the wind direction too, because 10 feet with a good wind might not be enough. So pay attention to the direction of the wind. And those burn times, that's law, that's state law. So pay attention to those burn times.
And people might wonder why.
Yeah, they correspond to wind speeds usually, right?
Right. So, like during the day, as the earth is heating, it stirs up the wind, and it's typically more windy during the day because of the heating process of the sun beating down on the earth. And in the evenings, the winds die down because that heating process has disappeared, right? And so that is why they have you burn in the evenings after the sun has started to decrease.
And the days are getting longer. So it's become a little bit more feasible to burn after 6. And if you're in Ohio, 6 p.m.
Yeah.
Maybe yeah, it's probably still it is still dark before 6 a.m. But like I think now we're getting to the point where there's some light, there's some residual light at 6 p.m. And
As the days are getting longer.
if you have all your materials ready and the winds aren't really that strong at that point and everything's looking good, then you could still work after 6 p.m.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And, it's nice. You have a nice little bonfire in the evening, and you can throw some hot dogs on there and cook dinner. That's another thing. Whenever you're having an open burn like that, you want to stay with it. You have to stay with it. You're required to keep an eye on it and make sure that it's not falling over or spreading, or your embers are being controlled. You do need to watch any open burn situation. And you do want to make sure that you have some method of controlling it should it start to escape. So it could be a hose, it could be a few large buckets of water or sand. So if you don't have access to water where you are, grabbing a couple buckets and filling them with sand, that can be used to put out the fire. And even having tools that can be used to smother the fire or to rake out the fire would be helpful if you think there's a potential for it to escape. And even if you don't, having those safety precautions on hand makes a big difference.
That's right. And now, just to kind of do a little bridge here. Another thing you can do right now is you can prune a lot of those dormant trees as we get into the end of February, and the frost damage risk is lower than it was before, even though it didn't seem like we had much of one this year anyway.
Right.
But it could still happen. But now, the end of February, the beginning of March is typically when we see a lot of pruning happening, whether it's fruit trees, whether it's just deciduous trees or shrubs. So, if you can't burn right away, just you maybe can do some pruning, and you can add those limbs, even though they're going to be kind of fresh, to the burn pile. Um,
Yeah, recognize if you're burning green wood, which is wood that's been recently harvested, you're gonna have a lot more smoke, and it's gonna be harder for it to
yeah,
burn. So do keep that in mind. I'm not saying it's impossible to burn, but
I was thinking smaller branches, depending on like the size of your brush pile. I'm thinking of in terms of cleaning up, right?
oh, yeah, yeah.
Like you're talking about brush piles earlier, and now that we are getting to the point where we could do some pruning.
Oh, it's a great time to prune your fruit trees and your shade trees.
Yeah, fruit trees, you want to prune those, let the air go through. Make sure that you have the strong branches that can hold fruit really well available. You're really mitigating some of the problems you can have with weak angled branches. We can go into that, but there are guides out there for fruit tree pruning. So if you have a fruit tree that you would like a little bit better production from, and you've never tried pruning, this might be a good time to pull up some fact sheets, call your extension office, and start getting a little bit more information on fruit tree pruning, so that you could possibly see better results as we go into 2023. As far as spring 2023, we're already well into 2023, aren't we?
Yeah. So one of the things that I have a problem with whenever I'm pruning something is I'm just like, "Oh, I should plant this. I could make this into a whole new plant," right? And so there's a couple things you can do. So with a fruit tree, if you want to propagate that fruit tree, you can then take that cutting and graft it. And we're going to have some really awesome grafting workshops at the Small Farm Conference this week. So if you can get down to Charleston, we'd love to have you. But another thing you can do is you can propagate those. So, especially if something like elderberry, elderberry is gaining in popularity. A lot of people are wanting to buy it. So, it's pushing up the value of those berries, and more people are wanting to plant it as a result, which is awesome, right? Especially because elderberry is a native plant here, and you can just kind of go out into a moist area and you can find elderberry all over the place. And if you want to bring some back to your farm, right now is a really good time to do that. Now, there's a couple different ways to propagate elderberry, and a lot of it has to do with what time of year you're looking at and how much labor you want to put into it. So if you're trying to propagate things in the summertime, that's when you're going to want to get yourself some sand or some cocoa coir and use that as a rooting medium inside to keep it moist, because you don't want the sticks that you're pruning off to dry out, right? But in winter, before a bud break, you can have either a really hard or a really easy way to do it. And of course, the easier, the less labor, the less success you're going to have. But if you have easy access to elderberries in the wild, then you can just pull off 20 stems or something to prune it and make it shapelier or healthier. and you're gonna take them back, and you can just basically stick them in the ground. But when you cut them, there are some specifics on how many nodes and how many buds you need.
Yeah. So what Karen is talking about is vegetative propagation. And when you do that, whether you're just putting it directly in the ground and letting it just produce roots from the wound itself, or whether you are a little bit more controlled about it and you cut cuttings. You cut cuttings, I guess there's no other way to say it. Um, and then and you actually put a root rooting hormone at the cut side, so that the wounding effect does induce root formation, but the addition of supplemental rooting hormone will help to promote it even faster. So a lot of times in more controlled situations, you do it with rooting hormone at the point of cut, and then there's different ways to do it. But if you're in a more controlled area or more controlled environment like that, what you want to do is you want to keep that plant from going back to dormancy or staying dormant. You're trying to push it so that the cutting doesn't dry up too fast and you are able to produce the roots. So in a controlled environment, some of the things you can do is have misters to kind of keep those cuttings moist. If you have photosynthetic material on there like leaves, they'll dry out a little bit faster, but you do have more metabolism in the cutting itself. So that's something that you'd really want misters on. In my case, I had pretty good success with a large green bud. I did some hardy figs, and I put a heating pad underneath the tray to kind of keep that soil warm, and that just helps keep it from staying dormant or going dormant. And it does produce a little bit more activity as far as cell replication for root formation. I kept it indoors, 60 degrees. A lot of people will say 80 degrees, kind of a nice warm environment. Either way, there was a heating from below where the soil was actually probably a little bit warmer than the environment was. And that does help with root development, and that metabolism will kind of increase a little bit. Kept it next to a nice window, and was able to produce some roots that I could put in larger pots for entire plant propagation. But that's a little bit more time consuming as far as, but typically if you're trying to propagate some more high value crops, in my case they were hardy figs, and if I just stuck a twig in the ground, I probably wouldn't be that successful because they're just not as hardy as something
Yeah.
like elderberries that Karen was talking about. So they're pay attention to the plant that you're trying to vegetatively propagate, and then think about the reasons why you're vegetatively propagating it, and you got to be patient. It took me a few months to actually start seeing anything happen. And you always wonder, you're like, what if I wasted my time here? But you just got to be patient, do it right, follow the protocols, and be patient. That's the best advice I can give for success in propagating that way.
Yeah, and you're gonna have a much higher success rate if you're doing that type of intensive care. Um, I am a much more hands-off person, and so I would be willing to take a little bit more of a loss. Like Dan said, elderberry is fairly easily accessible. Now, if you're using a special cultivar or something that you've purchased, then that's a little bit different. You're going to want to spend a little bit more effort to keep that alive. But if you're just experimenting and there's a lot of elderberry around you, now elderberry does like a moist, well drained soil. So make sure that you're planting it in the right type of location. But in the wintertime, so you can either do a woody stem transplant or you can do a root transplant. So the trick here is going to be to see if buds have broken yet, because you want to do both of these steps before bud break. And normally February is okay with no, before bud break, but who knows right now because everything's in bloom right now and it's really weird. Um, but typically, if you're going to use stems, you want to collect healthy stems, and hopefully you've scouted this plant out last year. You know that it's a good producer. It has lots of berries on it. It's got a good structure to it. It's healthy. It's not diseased, but you're going to harvest your cuttings. You want to have at least 3 distinct nodes. And okay, so the node is where the buds are attached to the branch. And so you want to find 3 distinct areas where there are buds, and you're going to harvest or cut it at an angular cut. Now, that's not it's the angle isn't necessarily important for the actual propagation of roots. What it is helpful for is to make sure that you put it the right direction into the soil. So you put the angular end of the cutting into the soil and then a flat cutting on the top. So you want 2 nodes below the soil line, and you want, the 1 node above the soil line. So you wanna make sure that you do not allow your cuttings to dry out at any point in time. So take a bucket of water out with you when you're doing your cuttings so that you can cut it and put it directly in the water as you're out in the field. And then you're going to put them directly into the soil, just jam it down in there into a nice, fertile, well drained, but moist soil. And of course, you're going to want to give it some supplemental water during that first season of growth, especially, it will be important. Now, if you're looking at you want to do some root transplants, you're going to go out again before bud break and you're going to gently harvest 4 to 6 inch long lengths of root. You want them to be about the diameter of a pencil. And you're going to take those root cuttings, cover them with about 3/4 to an inch of potting soil, or you can use a soilless medium. That's fine too. But you want to keep them warm and moist. Like Dan was saying, a heating mat, keeping them moist, those are going to be really important. Now, these root cuttings are often going to produce multiple plants. So, along several points of the root, there will be some dormant buds that will sprout and grow into a whole new plant. Once they've established, you can separate them and spread them out, but let them get a few extra leaves on them and look pretty healthy before you start doing that. But also remember anything that is being propagated or grown indoors, you don't want to put it outdoors until the risk of frost has passed. So that's really important. You need to harden them off just like you would your tomatoes or any other plants that are grown indoors to be transplanted outside.
Yeah, and they're going to be very sensitive, especially if they are metabolically active, and they'll respond to that frost. They're not hardened, they're not dormant. But one thing, Karen was talking about cutting at an angle in the areas that you are putting into the ground, and you have to remember that the wounding mechanism itself is a mechanical way to induce roots in the plant. It's just one of the responses you get. So a wounding response will typically produce roots,
Depending on where it is on the plant.
depending on where it is.
If it's under the ground, it'll make roots. If it's above the ground, it'll make branches or leaves.
Yes, yeah. There are many other signals, but that is one input that you can do. So I guess my point with this was a straight flat cut at the bottom, like a flush cut, won't really have that much surface area, but an angled cut will increase the surface areas quite a bit to allow for more root production. So more points of root formation in that cutting itself. So that is something to think about when you are trying to get something to root. And if it doesn't have roots, it's not really going to take off. So, and also, if it doesn't have roots, it's really not going to be pulling up too much moisture anyway. So you have to make sure you're keeping it from drying up, because once that cutting is all dried up, it's not going to come back. It can be dormant, but once it completely dries, it's not going to do anything. So because you have that increased potential of that cutting drying because the roots aren't pulling up water, you need to have some other mechanism, some means of keeping it from drying up. One is misting, as Karen was saying, just copious water.
But don't drown it.
Yeah, don't drown it, but make sure that you have it, that there's a little extra water in there, because it can't draw up the water like a well-developed root system can anyway.
Right.
So you want to make sure that it stays moist. And that's why in a controlled environment, having misters go off every few hours, just to kind of keep that high humidity around the cutting is beneficial, because it does prevent that drying from the top of the cutting, and it'll keep it from working its way down slower if you keep the humidity high up top.
Right.
And it gives the roots more of a chance to catch up and to be able to come back from basically having no roots to a mature plant with roots in a shoot.
Right. And, you can use this technique on a lot of woody species. Most woody plants will respond to these types of propagation techniques, but there are some things that you need to keep in mind. And I think we've gone over a lot of them. But for those of you who want a piece of paper to reference later, on last year's garden calendar, if you got a copy of it, you would have found a short article on growing wild elderberries written by yours truly. So if you didn't get the 2022 WVU Extension Garden Calendar, you can find it online and you can find that article in there. Just a really brief overview for those of you at home who just want a quick reminder on what to do. Now, if you want to get into growing elderberries for production, there is a really great detailed guide from the University of Vermont Extension called Growing Elderberries, a Production Manual and Enterprise Viability Guide for Vermont and the Northeast. It is a fantastic guide. It's 102 pages, though, so we're talking like there is a lot of detail here. But a lot of people work together on this. University of Maine, University of Vermont, and it's got an amazing amount of information. Once again, it is called Growing Elderberries, a Production Manual and Enterprise Viability Guide for Vermont and the Northeast. So please check that out. And if you have any questions on plant propagation, a great program that's coming up that's going to be starting shortly is the Master Gardener Training. At least our WVU Extension Master Gardener Training is starting up the first week of March. So if you're interested in becoming a Master Gardener, please contact your local West Virginia Extension office or your other state extension office and find out when their Master Gardener program is coming up, because it is a international program now. It's in multiple countries and it is nationally recognized. And so please look into that if you have a love of gardening, or you're just getting started and you want to know more because you feel like you're overwhelmed. This is a great opportunity for you to meet other people that can help support you in your gardening endeavors and maybe make some new friends.
So we actually just finished up a Master Gardener training in December, really not that long ago. Usually we do it every other year, so this is kind of the off year. There are online training opportunities available. There's no problems in getting you transferred into a county after you take that course. That's something that you work with the extension office in your county. So I guess what I'm trying to say is you don't necessarily have to wait a year. But if you are interested, please reach out to the Belmont County Extension Office, and I'll be happy to assist you as far as getting you ready for that.
All the Master Gardeners have all sorts of great programs that come about throughout the year. So look into the Master Gardeners and find out what programs they're doing near you. Even if you're not a Master Gardener volunteer, they'd love to have you participate. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.